Okay, so if we look at the things people care about that don't freaking matter in terms of diet, they fixate on weird buzzwords. Like they fixate on they don't even have to be weird words, but like sugar, for example. There has been such scaremongering around sugar to the point that people don't delineate between added sugars to the diet versus sugar that is intrinsic or naturally occurring in foods.
For fruit.
Things like fruit, fresh fruit. And even milk has naturally occurring sugar in it, lactose. Can be problematic for some of the population, but look at fresh fruit. I've actually heard people vilify fruit because it has sugar. And it's one thing to take an idea and put out a plausible claim. Okay, so yeah, it's got sugar. And then, we all know that if you add a ton of sugar to the diet, you lower the quality of the diet, and then you can push your bets towards negative health consequences down the line. Okay, that's fine. That's reasonable. But even though fruit has sugar, it also has a ton of other beneficial components to it. And it's in this low-calorie, high-water, high micronutrient density package that is satiating and displaces stomach space for otherwise junky foods that a lot of people would have consumed instead of that fruit. But beyond all that, forget about all the reasoning and stuff. Let's look at the literature. Does fruit cause negative health consequences? Does it cause things like impaired blood glucose control? Does it cause obesity? Does it cause weight gain? It does the opposite of all those things. Fresh fruit actually has been shown to improve glycemic control, improve body weight, improve body composition, and improve the protection against a range of cardiometabolic diseases and cancer. So it doesn't really matter what anybody says. We just have to face the evidence. There's something called the glycemic index that was big in the 80s and 90s, and it's kind of come back around again. Glycemic index. You gotta avoid the high glycemic index foods and things like that. And there's a couple of fruits that actually have a high glycemic index, and that would be pineapples and watermelons.
Watermelons?
Yeah, high on the GI scale. But the way that glycemic index is determined is you get 50 grams of carbohydrate from a given food, regardless of the amount that you have to eat. 50 grams of it, and then you measure its effect on your blood sugar levels for 2 hours after ingestion.
I was going to say, because watermelon's seen as keto-friendly, which is... But
watermelons have what's called a low glycemic load. So they have a very low amount of carbohydrate per serving.
Yeah, per serving, yeah.
Even though the carbohydrate itself, if you were to gather 50 grams of it, would have a more pronounced effect on blood sugar elevations.
Brilliant.
And so even though those fruits have a high GI and certain foods have a high GI, they have a low glycemic load. And ultimately, people need to stop and think about things. Like the longest living populations on the planet do not avoid fruit. The fruit is a regular part of their intake.
What about the white stuff? The white sort of added sugar. Is it called refined sugar?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, refined, or we can call it added sugar. Mm-hmm.
What about the added sugar?
Added sugar is problematic in two different ways, at least. So the first way is it's diluting the nutrient density of the diet. It's a phenomenon called micronutrient dilution, when you have just a bunch of junk, micronutrient-free calories in the diet. The other way that it poses a problem is because it is usually packaged with highly processed and engineered refined carbohydrate and fat combination foods. So your classic desserts, pastries, cookies, cakes, things like that. And so the sugar itself, if I were to just put a jar of sugar in front of you and say, hey, I challenge you to not just spoon that in, you'll go, oh, no problem. People paint sugar out to be this inherently evil thing, but the way that it gets into trouble is when it is a part of these hyper-palatable, highly processed, highly engineered dessert and snack foods. And so that is the main issue with added sugar. And the various health organizations, I mentioned the Institute of Medicine, or now the National Academy of Medicine, saying, hey, we need to cut off our added sugars at 25% of the diet. There's the World Health Organization, who presents the sort of the absolutely terrified version of that, where they want people to max out their added sugar to 5% of the calories in the diet. But that's usually not realistic. And it gets a little bit extreme to the point of being pathological. So
what would you say?
about 10% of total calories max with added sugar. And that would fall kind of right into this discretionary caloric allotment of 10 to 20% of calories, kind of from whatever you want. And I would want to qualify that 10 to 20% margin by saying that if you're hypercaloric, in other words, if you're consuming more calories than you're taking in, you're trying to gain weight or something like that, you probably want to keep your discretionary calorie allotment to 10%, or your indulgence food to 10% rather than 20%.